Yes! My god, it's just like the E3 tech demo! Final Fantasy VII came out over 20 years ago on PlayStation. Now we've got Final Fantasy VII Remake, which is essentially the same game with better graphics. Or is it? We're gonna be talking about all that and more, but first, coffee. These are today's beans. They are the Kenya. Have a look at those tasty beans. So first, a quick disclaimer, I haven't played the whole game. The game came out literally today, and I've played a couple hours of it because there's only been a couple hours to play so far. But there were a few things that I was worried about going into a game which is essentially a remake of a game which is so formative to my life that it probably informed big decisions like the fact that I'm now living in Japan, among other things. Let's grind! And the first big one that I should probably share with you, which I've probably told you in previous videos as well, is that Final Fantasy formed a number of essays that I wrote at university. And on top of that, my undergraduate thesis was the narrative role of music in role-playing games, Final Fantasy VII. So you could say that I kind of have a degree thanks to this video game. We were waiting for an HD remake of this game for the longest time, even before HD remakes of games was a thing. We were like, we really need to have this game again, but with better graphics. Now that we've seen what FF8 was capable of, or what FF11 was capable of, or FF12 was capable of, or FF15 especially, you know, looking at Final Fantasy 13 and 15, it was just like, okay, we have clearly got it now. We need to have Final Fantasy VII, but with these graphics. And that's probably exactly what the producers of Final Fantasy VII were thinking. They're like, okay, well, is it now? Is it now? Is it now? When do we do this? And I remember watching an early interview for Final Fantasy VII, the producers, when they're talking about making a remake of this game. And the big decision for them was that if they do commit to making a remake of Final Fantasy VII, that means they're going to be working on Final Fantasy VII and nothing else probably for the next 10 years, potentially 5, 10, 15 years, depending on how big a project they want it to be. And as you can see, the scope has easily bloomed into a multi-game project. Since the beginning, it was Final Fantasy VII, then after that we had Crisis Core, and then we also had the mobile games, all sorts of other spin-off games attached to Final Fantasy VII. But this time, even within just the main game, we've got this is only part 1, and I assume that we're going to have like a part 2 and a part 3 after this. So the game is massively huge in scope, clearly going to take a lot more effort, but then they have to think about when they're going to do it, because these producers have been working on video games for a long time, which means some of these people are probably in their 50s, 60s, or 70s. Potentially, they're either coming out of retirement to work on this, or they're already expecting to retire soon. So if potentially Final Fantasy VII is the biggest thing you've ever worked on, and now you're looking at potentially working on something that might be your final piece of work for the rest of your life, for your entire career, you're gonna want to make it pretty big and pretty special, right? And so I played Final Fantasy VII Remake so far, well, for a couple hours on stream today, and I just wanted to give you my first impressions of how it felt to play, because as you can imagine, graphically, of course, it's fantastic, but this is clearly more than just an HD remake. And first of all, it doesn't play like the original game very much at all. Story-wise, you're going to see familiar characters, you're going to see all the familiar scenes, and you're going to see a lot of familiar places. But at the center of Final Fantasy VII was the fact that it's a role-playing game. It's not just role-playing, and it's not just a movie, it was a role-playing game. And in the original game, it was a role-playing, turn-based game. And in that regard, it was really different, because this game is definitely, well, maybe at least only for the first couple hours as they're easing you into it, this is clearly like a very moving cinematic experience, and then in between the cinematic experience, they let you do stuff in between. But it feels very much like the gameplay is there to like service this incredible story that they're trying to tell. I mean, right from the very beginning, I've always thought of Final Fantasy VII as one of the very first games I ever played that really changed the way I thought about video games and what was possible in terms of storytelling. And of course, plenty of other games before that had also told excellent stories, but it was the way that Final Fantasy VII did it. A bit like how Ninja Gaiden came in and showed us what it was like to have a platform game but with cutscenes, right? With Final Fantasy VII, it did something very similar. It was like, it's an RPG, but this time it's very much more 3D than it was before, because back in 1997, 3D graphics was kind of a new thing, but it was the real marriage of the fact that it was a game and a story, and it wasn't exactly like one was more important than the other. But if I'm comparing FF7 to FF7 Remake, it definitely felt like in FF7, even though it was a supreme marriage of story and gameplay, it definitely felt like, compared to the remake, gameplay was more important in FF7, and in Remake, it's more like, wow, did you see the story that we were able to tell using a video game with FF7? In Remake, we're going to really let that story come to the forefront. And you're going to be playing a game in between as well. But it's like, whoa, experience Final Fantasy VII. It's not just a movie, it's not just a game, it's this incredible, really amazing experience. And you have to have it. And it is an incredible experience, but here's the thing. It's an experience that we've already had. It's not possible, surely, to play the game again and still experience it like you did the first time you played FF7 and you didn't know what was going to happen. Final Fantasy VII Remake has found a way to really justify its existence as a remake. It is not just FF7 with better graphics and different gameplay and really incredible design. It's a game that is self-aware that it's a remake, self-aware that you're playing something that you think you've already been through before, but it changes it up in a really impressive way that I was just not expecting. Alright, I'm going to be very careful not to go into too many spoilers, but if you're absolutely adamant about experiencing the game completely firsthand yourself, then you may not want to listen to this part, but I'm avoiding any specific spoilers in general. There were points when certain characters started to show up a little bit earlier than I was expecting. So this guy's showing up, that guy's showing up, and now they're starting to baby you a little bit too much. I was like, they really don't expect people to understand properly or get interested in the game unless all these things are explained to them at the beginning. But then it takes a little bit of a turn, because there is a point where a character, Sephiroth, looks over at Cloud. Again, this is all in the first couple hours of the game. He says to Cloud, he's like, there are people that you can't save, or you're just not capable of saving others. And it's like, he's reflecting on something that happens in Final Fantasy VII, and lots of things that happen in Final Fantasy VII, because right from the offset of this game, you're a group of people that are trying to save the planet. He's alluding to things that haven't yet happened, and he can't be starting to feel insecure about them. It just basically felt that they're not speaking to Cloud, really. They're speaking to the viewer and Cloud. Because in Final Fantasy VII, he didn't have regrets like that. He didn't have thoughts like that because he hadn't been through those experiences yet. Not quite. I mean, in some ways, maybe he had, but in other ways, mainly not. Again, this is all sounding very confusing if you haven't played the original game. But that's when it started to really feel like a traditional Japanese drama movie, Japanese anime movie. And this happens actually, I feel like this happens quite a lot in Japanese dramas, where someone goes through a time slip and they're able to go through their life again, but this time do things differently. That is one genius way to justify the existence of this game completely. Why else go through all this again unless you're actually Cloud from the future who's been sent back in time to kind of re-experience these things, but this time with the power potentially to do it differently. And that would justify for the viewer as well. I say the viewer, the gamer as well. It would justify for them a reason to go through all this again, because now you have the potential to change what actually happened. Let's taste some of this Kenya. Oh, tastes like pencil lead. So you have to forgive me, I've literally just come off the stream and I've got my thoughts still completely fresh in my mind about how I felt about the gameplay. It really felt very much to me like this was what they were doing with the game. Throwing in these references to characters that usually don't show up until much later. Throwing in these speech clips about being unable to save people and not having the power to do certain things like this. These are all things that you would know only if you had played Final Fantasy VII before. Now, it's entirely possible that these are features that they're just throwing in so that when you play through this again, after you know what actually happened and you hear more about the history and more about what's actually going on in these people's lives, maybe it's just for the second playthrough, so that you actually, you watch these clips and you're like, oh yeah, now I know what he's talking about. But this is a remake. This is a game that is probably going to be mostly played by a lot of people who have already played Final Fantasy VII. And it just makes perfect sense for Cloud to be not the original Cloud, but this is FF7 Remake Cloud. Cloud who has already been through this whole thing before, and then in a sort of Deus Ex Machina move, everything gets undone, the world is saved, and he's been given the chance to do it differently this time. So while I was playing through this, I actually kind of said it while playing. It reminds me of this movie that came out on Netflix, and it's a Japanese movie called Erased. Now the Japanese title is Boku Dake ga Inai Machi, which translates to something like the town where I'm the only one who doesn't exist. Anyway, it's an incredible movie and I highly recommend it, but essentially that was exactly how it felt playing the first couple hours of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Cloud keeps having these moments where he's looking at people and he's kind of like, he's feeling all these connections to people that he shouldn't technically feel yet, except for the fact that in the original Final Fantasy VII, there are aspects of the fact that Cloud has certain amounts of memory loss, and so he does discover things, even within the original game, he does kind of look at people and go like, oh, you are familiar. Wait a minute, I don't know you. There's no reason I should know you. Oh my goodness, and you know, there are all these realization moments in Final Fantasy VII, and again, I don't want to spoil too much. That's a massive, massive part of why the game is so memorable and why people were so incredibly moved by it, because it was not the type of story that we'd ever experienced in something like a video game before. And because it was a video game, even if it were a story that has existed in literature in other places before, experiencing it as a video game had a completely different effect to any way that we'd experienced movies or literature or plays or anything of that sort. And again, without trying to get too much into the detail of my thesis, video games give you a certain amount of agency, as in you like share your existence with the character, that you don't really get as much with other forms of media like books or movies or plays. Now that changes quite a lot with games these days because they're quite realistic, and because they've got their own voices, there's a larger feeling these days of video game characters retaining their agency, like their existence, even when you turn the game off. But before the days when we had voice acting and hyper-realistic graphics, it definitely felt like characters had less agency than they do now. So while playing Final Fantasy VII Remake, I was just massively getting this feeling. I was like, oh, it's just like this movie, Erased. And actually, this is quite common. I'm pretty sure I've seen it in other movies as well, especially because Deus Ex Machina, when everything gets erased and then goes back to the way it was, like, because that's so common in anime all the time. I just kept thinking about how this is really the ideal way to justify people playing the same story again, because it won't be the same story. Or rather, even if it is the same story, it offers that promise, that potential that things could be different this time, which I think is such a universal concept in human life, especially because life is so finite. You know, we know that it is going to end. We don't know what happens when it ends, but we do know that life as we know it does stop at a certain point, or at least that's the strongest concept of what we have for life right now. And as a result of life being finite like this, we also have this massive concept of our decisions having a certain amount of weight. And especially for a character like Cloud, main character of Final Fantasy VII, he goes from sort of not caring about anything to caring a little bit about something to caring so much that he lets it kind of ruin his life. He can't really move on after this point because of what happened. He wished it could have been different, and because he's unable to change it, the rest of his life, after the game finishes, they go on to another movie like Advent Children, where they show that he's become this completely useless fool who just kind of mopes around, unable to get on with his life, because he's still regretting what happened in Final Fantasy VII. Well, wouldn't it be nice if we had a game where Cloud is able to go back in time, not officially, but in spirit? He's able to go back in time and give it a second shot. Now, it's not the same as in Erased, because in the movie Erased, the main character actually retains his memories, so he knows exactly who he is. He goes back in time, he's like, wait a minute, why am I my 7-year-old self again? I've still got all the memories and all the thoughts, all the teaching that he's received. He's become an adult in real life, but he's actually just gone back to his 7-year-old self, and he's just looking around like, wait, this is wrong, why am I here? From what I've seen from the first couple hours of Final Fantasy VII Remake, Cloud is not like super self-aware like that. He's just got these weird moments of deja vu, and that feels like that it's best that way, keeping it ambiguous like that. With Final Fantasy VII, it's not 100% clear like it's a time slip, but it's also not 100% clear that this is the first time this has happened. So it's somewhere there in the middle, and I think I'm gonna have to coin a term for this. I'm gonna call it remake territory, or maybe justified remake territory. And as Sephiroth is speaking to Cloud, it's almost like he's talking directly to the person playing the video game. Your fear is that you aren't able to save the ones you love. In fact, it's the regret that you couldn't save the ones you loved. Well, here's your second chance. What are you gonna do about it? At least that's how it felt to me playing that scene. I just felt like that scene was handled so well that it makes me feel like I can justify devoting hours, maybe potentially 30 to 40 hours, playing through this first part of the game, and then maybe if new games come out, I want to invest myself again in Final Fantasy VII. And I'm gonna be honest, I wasn't that interested in reinvesting myself in Final Fantasy VII. Now this is a discussion for a different time, but I get quite concerned when I see things that are remakes, retellings, or remasters, because it has been seen, especially in the movie sphere, where companies have decided to re-release like a better quality version of a movie, but at the same time, they've changed story elements. The most famous one that comes to mind is when a certain company decided to re-release Star Wars. In the old versions of the movie, Han Solo shoots a guy. Like, he thinks that this person's come to collect money or potentially kill him, but instead of waiting to find out, he just shoots him first. Now that's how it was in the original edit, but then in successive releases of this movie, which were potentially more HD, or they were DVD, or they were Blu-ray, or whatever excuse they had to come out with new versions of the movie, they also changed history. The first time they changed it, it was that both people shot at the same time, and then eventually the version, which I think we have now, is the one where apparently that bounty hunter who's come to collect the money or collect his, or kill him, he actually shoots first, misses, and then Han Solo protects himself, and he shoots and he kills this person. Now, whether that is a justified change to a movie doesn't even matter. The fact remains that when companies remake these things, they may potentially be trying to change history. You can try to cover up the story that you created, but the fact that Han Solo shot this guy in the original edit can't be changed. That's how it was at the start. And the reason I'm particularly concerned about Final Fantasy VII is because this game, one, had a brothel in it, right? Which I think is probably the reason why it wasn't on Nintendo. That's the rumor I heard when I was a kid. They were like, hey, did you know this game's not coming out on N64? And it's just because there's a brothel in it. Okay, so that was the rumor that was going around when this game originally released in 1997. But I haven't reached that scene in the remake yet, so who knows how they've changed it or toned it down, but definitely we are in a world where what's politically correct is very different to what was politically correct in 1997. So when Final Fantasy VII first starts, you're actually going to destroy a power plant. A power plant which, if it explodes, will kill innocent civilians who were in it and potentially innocent civilians who were nearby. And as far as I remember, in the original game, they know that this is going to happen. They just think that the civilian death cost is a necessary requirement to save the entire planet. Well, it doesn't seem that that's the case with Final Fantasy VII Remake, and I do want to go through the original game again just to double check the dialogue, because it's very possible that I'm just remembering the details differently. But as I remember it, there was no mistake when they planted the bomb. They didn't think that the explosion was going to be smaller. They made an explosion, people died, and they knew it was going to happen. In FF7 Remake, when the bomb goes off and it destroys the reactor and it destroys a lot of life and people around it, Jesse says something like, oh, I don't know, that wasn't supposed to happen. Like, I created the bomb just as I was supposed to, but it exploded and there must have been a weird reaction and it killed way more people than we were expecting. And it's like, no, wait a minute. You're trying to change it so that instead of these people being evil at the start and then ending up heroes at the end, you're trying to change it that they were heroes at the start and they're still heroes at the end, which is exactly what happened with Han Solo. The Han Solo story, part of what I think drew people to the character. And he was evil at the start. He went straight out and he shot a guy without any permission and without any real justification, apart from just he thought his own life was at risk, so he shot this guy. Instead of waiting for proof that this person was out for his life, Han Solo just shoots this guy first anyway. The fact that someone that vigilante could end up joining the rebellion and then fighting for a cause and potentially risking his life for something that's bigger than himself, that's a very big part of what made Han Solo who he was, right? I mean, only within the first 2 hours of the game, I've already experienced what I think seems like an attempt to soften the evilness of what's actually going on with these characters. But the reason I don't mind so far is because I was so impressed by the way that they strung in events that you're not supposed to see yet. And not just to keep you interested, because that's what I thought was happening on my first playthrough. I thought, well, they're just throwing in Sephiroth too early. They're seeding your mind with all these things that you don't need to know. But when there's that scene where Sephiroth confronts Cloud about the fact that, you know, you can't save these people and you're incapable of doing this thing, and he's really playing on the fact that this is Cloud's biggest insecurity. He's a massive complex about the fact that he wishes he could have done more. I just felt like that was a really beautiful way to justify the game's existence, to justify people who've already played the game before, well, the original game, to play the remake, so go through what might be the same story again, because there is that potential that this time it could be different. And that's what the hero wants. A chance to be better, to be more. As I say, it's only the first couple hours I've been playing the game, but wow, I've already been so inspired so far. It looks incredible. It sounds incredible. I have to admit, sometimes the music feels a little bit too subtle. It's like, it's the old theme, but it's been over-orchestrated to the point that the theme has become less bold. I understand the need to tone it down a little bit and have the themes be a little more subtle with their orchestrations. But I think that some of them were a little too subtle and they kind of just disappeared into the background, into that sort of Batman Begins kind of, it's music, but it's not really music, or it's music, but it's not really thematic, so I can't even remember how it goes. So there you have it, my first impressions from my first couple hours of playing through Final Fantasy VII Remake. I am definitely going to play through the rest of this. I need to know how it plays out, and I want to see if it really delivers on that potential, or even if it doesn't deliver on the potential and give you the ability to change the past, I want to see if it continues to tempt you to play more, giving you that kind of feeling of potential that you could change things and do more. And I just love how that the game is really self-aware like that in knowing who is going to be playing this game and what they're going to be feeling. Mostly feelings of deja vu. As in, it's deja vu because you think you've been there before, but wait, it's kind of different. So clearly I haven't been here before. So you know what I mean? And at the same time, it justifies it for the developers because look, these are people who already spent years of their lives making this game. It was like $25 million. It was like the biggest video game project of all time when it came out in 1997 to re-embark on this journey again, but this time at a much larger scale. It's like these people are dedicating potentially the last most important project of their career, and they may either retire while this project is happening, or they've already retired, or they're going to retire right after this project. Whatever it is, this is like the last big huzzah for some of these people, and I really like that they're kind of justifying it to themselves as well by going an extra mile and doing something special with this. That's all for now. Don't forget to comment, subscribe, share the links and all that great stuff, and let me know in the comments. I would love to know how you have found the first few hours, even if you haven't completed the game. Don't spoil anything, if at all possible. Don't tell me what happens. I don't want to know what happens after the first couple hours of the game, but I do want to know how you're finding the game and what your first impressions of Final Fantasy VII Remake are in general. So comment below. I'll see you on Discord and or Twitter and or the next Twitch stream. See you then.